Fox 10's John Hook.
It is one of the most pressing issues in our state, funding higher education. We've talked a lot throughout the campaign and recently about what to do about the problems funding K through 12 education. But the state of Arizona, by statute, has to fund higher education, talking about the 3 state universities as well. Eileen Klein is the president of the Arizona Board of Regents. She oversees the 3 state universities and the Board of Regents, made up of 12 diverse members, serving 140,000 students and a budget just north of $4 billion. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, so nice to see you.
What you may not know, or you may if you follow politics, Eileen Klein served as chief of staff for Governor Brewer and took the helm in the midst of a severe financial crisis and economic downturn. So she has seen this from both sides, from the governor's side on the 9th floor to the head of the Board of Regents. Thank you again for being here. The budget has passed. How draconian are these cuts to higher education?
The cuts to higher education are tough. The budget definitely packed a wallop. In fact, about 60% of all cuts made in the budget were directed at higher ed.
60%.
And that equates to about 14% of the university's operating budget. So these cuts will have an impact. And right now, that's what we're measuring. How will it impact students and families and services?
You were told originally it might be about $77 million on a cut. You didn't like it, but you said, you know, we can probably live with that. We don't like it. And then it ends up going up to 104 million.
Right. So the original budget that was proposed by Governor Ducey was tough. It was about a 10% cut, around $77 million. But the presidents and the board came together and said we can do some belt tightening. It will be tough, but the board also felt confident it might not need to raise tuition. The cuts at this level, however, they increased by about 30% by the time the final budget came out, and consequently all bets are off. It's going to be really tough to figure out how we're going to make this work, but we will make it work. The challenge is really going forward. How are we going to continue to make it work?
Can you make it work without the universities raising tuition? Because they have made promises saying we're going to try to hold the line, because our tuition increases in this state, as you know, have gone up higher than any other state in the country.
Yes, Arizona has had the largest budget cuts and correspondingly the largest increases in tuition. That is not sustainable. Our families can't afford it. So we're going to be very measured. We want to be sure that we're minimizing the impact on tuition. Having said that, it's hard to say right now what will happen. We've done a lot to stabilize and introduce more predictability into our tuition models, but it's so highly dependent on what the state provides. So even in this budget, there will be $1,000 less per student to support their education. It's going to be made up somewhere.
Is there a threshold? We talked about the statutory obligation of the state to fund higher ed, just as it has to fund K through 12. Is there a threshold outlined as to how much the state has to fund?
No, there is nothing in statute that puts a floor on the amount of funding, nor a ceiling, and so really it's determined politically. And if you look at what's been happening over time, the amount of funding dedicated to higher ed has been declining. Today, the state only provides about 23% of the cost of a student's education. It's completely opposite than before the downturn.
In the best times, what was that ratio?
Let's just take before the Great Recession began.
Okay.
The state provided more than half of the support for students.
So 50% was kind of a...
Right, so it's kind of an even deal. The students contributed, the state contributed. And certainly there's a public benefit to having a student be educated and be a more productive member of the workforce. That's really valuable to the state, so it makes sense. But over time, that shifted more and more and more, and students now are bearing the major load of not just the cost of their own education, but funding the universities.
Let me take you back. We're going to run tape number 1 here. This is right after the budget passed, and this will give you kind of a primer on where we are right now.
The loser in the new state budget, higher education. $100 million slashed from universities and 100% of state funding cut from Pima and Maricopa County community colleges.
These Republican legislators will tell you, well, we have to cut these budgets so it'll boost the economy. It absolutely does the opposite.
Both the presidents of ASU and the University of Arizona echoing protesters this week, saying the cuts will have a devastating effect on the universities.
Students are going to come out of undergraduate, at least, with more student loan debt. They're going to start their lives in a debt hole, which means they have a less of an impact on our economy. It will drag our economy.
Republicans say the $9 billion budget made necessary cuts to deal with a deep deficit.
I'd love to give them that back plus more if we could, but we don't have the money.
those painful decisions that have to be made if you're going to balance and get to zero, and balance that sheet.
Democrats are also upset with how the budget was passed, saying it was rushed. Lawmakers hashed it out until the early morning hours.
We didn't go to the floor until midnight. We waited around all day. We didn't get the final details of the budget until we were on the floor.
Republicans say the morning session is just part of the political process.
I don't want to get into, tit for tat. It's just, this is my third budget, and although I don't like it, that's the process.
Eileen Klein is the president of the Arizona Board of Regents, which oversees the 3 state universities. She's our guest on Newsmaker Sunday. Did this come down to, at the end, the governor making a calculation that between higher ed and K through 12, he'd rather fund K through 12 because higher ed has the opportunity to get the money through tuition increases?
Certainly, there has been an effort to prioritize K-12 in the state budget for quite a long time. That makes sense. But there are so few choices about where to make cuts. Higher ed is one of the last unprotected areas in the state budget, so I'd be careful before I'd really assume what the governor's true priorities are. The point is, if we can get this budget in balance, and let's hope that it stays that way, where do we go from here? That's when we can really begin to assess, and it's imperative, really, that we start to work with the governor and lawmakers to redirect dollars into higher education. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to provide the opportunities that we need for our citizens.
Are there revenue streams that the university presidents are starting to say, we have to do this, this, and this to kind of backfill?
There are
online education, whatever it might be.
So the universities have been in the process of becoming much more entrepreneurial. They are trying to diversify their revenue streams. They're also trying to become more efficient, and they're trying to create much more affordable pathways for students so that students can either go online, they can start at a community college. There should be many ways that students can achieve their higher education dreams. And they shouldn't just be dreams. We have to be sure that because of the jobs requiring more credentials after high school, that the state is providing its fair share to make sure that people are prepared. That's really the heart of the debate. So as flexible as we want the universities to be, as entrepreneurial as we want them to be, there's no substitute for that injection of state funding. And that's what we really need to work with the governor and the policymakers on.
Okay, so clear something up for me. I think we're north of $1 trillion in student loan debt across the country. I mean, it's a huge problem.
It is.
Has that been driven by state legislatures around the country slashing funding for higher ed during this downturn? And so consequently, the universities, colleges have to raise their tuition, and then you get into this cycle, vicious cycle. Is that what's happened?
I would argue that actually the advent of a lot of the federal funds have encouraged states to divest. And it has allowed more students, it has allowed...
In other words, put it on your own credit card.
Right,
we can't fund it.
It has allowed governments to wash their hands of their obligations, and in Arizona this is a constitutional obligation to students. That's not a good trend. It's one that students can't afford. So we're fortunate in Arizona. Our student debt is slightly lower than the national average, but it's still about $22,000 per student. And we simply can't ask them to take on additional debt before they get really started in life and in their career. We need that shared responsibility from the state, between the families and the state. It is one of the chief priorities in our Constitution.
This is tricky because you don't want to get in a turf war where you're battling against K through 12.
Right.
Because you need K through 12 to be successful.
We do.
To feed students who are,
We do.
I don't want to say college and career ready because that's a bad term to some people, pivoting off of Common Core. But you need kids who are ready to go.
Yes, absolutely.
So you don't want to get in a turf war.
No,
right?
and we shouldn't be making what I consider to be false choices
Either
between
or.
funding K-12
Right.
or funding higher ed. We need to make sure that all of it is adequately funded. But also we need to make sure that universities are really freed up to be even more entrepreneurial. So we're also seeking a lot of regulatory reforms so that we can be more free to design benefit structures that are more affordable in the long run and that hopefully will hold down the costs for our families.
We're going to make a little bit of news here because you met with the governor for over an hour.
I did.
Now this is interesting because again, you know his playbook because you were Governor Brewer's chief of staff. Conversely, he was on the Board of Regents. So you worked with him as well in that capacity. You know him well.
I do, and I was very privileged to serve as a co-chair of his transition team. And I, like so many people, and we all should be committed to his success. So we had a chance to sit down this week. I was so glad for the time because...
Tell me how that works, okay? Just take me inside that. Where did you meet, first of all?
Well, in his office.
Okay.
And we sat down and just talked really forthrightly about the challenges of the budget, the need to get the budget balanced, try to do that as quickly as possible. And then he talked about his desire to really partner with the higher education team, the university presidents, myself, the Board of Regents, to chart a new course. And so I'm eager for him to issue us that challenge, to bring him a plan and for him to really embrace a new plan that can set a new model for higher education, not just in Arizona, but for the nation.
What might that look like? Would that be a commitment from the state to fund at a certain level, and then what would be coming in from the university side?
To be sure, we would need a plan that includes a sustainable funding source in the sense that we need to understand what...
Statutorily required?
Or just a certain level that we would agree that the state needs to be contributing toward the cost of a student's education. And then beyond that, we'd like to work with him on organizational design, operational flexibility. He's indicated that he's open to all of the reforms that we have suggested. And again, we would like for him just to challenge us to be as bold as possible in redesigning a model that's going to work really for our state's second century going forward.
Is that model a little bit of what Dr. Crow has tried to do at ASU, to make it a university for everyone?
That is actually the aspiration for all of our state universities. So we want to have high quality but highly accessible institutions in this state.
Can you have both?
We can have both. We do have both. The question is, will they be affordable? That's the challenge before us.
Do you believe that right now students are taking on too much debt? And do you think the federal government to some degree has created this problem? A lot of loose money. I
absolutely believe that students are being asked to shoulder too much of the burden. They and their families simply can't afford it. If you look at K-12, look at our K-12 pipeline today, these students are even more financially challenged. More students are living in poverty. Those obstacles are even greater. So our state's going to need to innovate to make sure that these students can be prepared. Again, 2/3 of the jobs in just a couple of years are going to require post-secondary education. The state's going to have to be a partner in that to make them successful.
Okay, that gets into another debate about whether a college education is worth it. If a kid is taking on $22,000 on average of debt, you know, there are some who are out there arguing. You hear it on talk radio saying this thing is overplayed and it's not worth it. And they usually point to Steve Jobs or Bill Gates. These are exceptions, not the rule, right?
We hear this all the time. People question the value proposition of higher education, and I say it is more important than ever. And it's very clear when you look at the data. The data demonstrates it time and again, even during the Great Recession, that people who had more advanced education were more likely to keep their jobs. They're definitely going to earn more over their lifetimes. But we can't ask them to just only take on the debt in the short term to make themselves successful. Our state has an interest in doing this, and it's important for our state's economy. We are not going to attract employers if we don't have a qualified workforce, and that means people with baccalaureate degrees, to be sure, graduate degrees, and 2-year degrees. Lots of credentials after high school. Universities are an important part of that, and we need the entire complement available.
When we come back with Eileen Klein, she's the president of the Arizona Board of Regents, we're going to talk about competition and whether that's been good or bad for the state universities. Talking about places like University of Phoenix, for example. There are other options out there. We're back on Newsmaker Sunday talking about higher ed and the challenges the state faces in funding and trying to get back on Newsmaker Sunday with the president of the Arizona Board of Regents, Eileen Klein. She oversees the 3 state universities and the Board of Regents, which is made up of 12 diverse members. Let me throw something at you. 80% tuition increase from 2008 to 2014. Funding got cut at the same time, nearly by half in Arizona from state funding for the universities. So less state funding, tuition goes way up to make up the difference, and that's where we are, essentially.
That's where we are, right.
And because the universities can charge tuition, which K through 12 can't, it appears to me the governor tried to preserve K through 12 with full knowledge that, hey, we promised no tuition hikes, but look, that's at least a safety valve for me.
So the tuition certainly has been used as a safety valve, but it's going to run out of its possibilities at some point.
What's the downside of that?
At some point, we're going to price ourselves out, and we just simply can't assume that students will pay whatever we charge. There's a limit on what can be charged. So we provide high value, high quality degrees, but we're starting to run out of capacity. And there's also an element of equity and fairness about this. The Constitution presumes that tuition will be nearly as free as possible. We have a lot of people questioning whether we've blown past that already.
I think we have.
And so those are really some very serious policy considerations. And you can see the extent to which people have reacted to the budget. It has their attention, particularly for families who are working so hard so that they have a chance to send their kids to college.
Yeah, and their kids are getting near college age and they're freaking out because they don't think they can afford it. Clear something up for me. Let me play devil's advocate. When the folks in Washington start saying, let's let everybody, it reminds me of the housing bubble. Everybody should own a home. Everybody should own a home. This is a great idea. Well, the truth is, not everybody should own a home. Not everyone can afford to make the payments on a home. That's why you have apartments and other dwellings, to give people options. Higher ed, they have put so much money into this with student loans, allowing that money to be borrowed. How do you convince somebody out there that tuition hasn't shot up because of that? That, in other words, all the free money, hey, let's raise the rate because all these kids can borrow to the hilt. Let's raise the rates and make more.
There are some who certainly would argue that the availability of those funds has encouraged institutions to raise tuition. But
do you believe that's happened?
I do think in some instances that has happened. I think in the public university system, that's one of the reasons we have a Board of Regents, to hold check against that. We have a group of citizens who are sitting there for a primary purpose of making sure that we aren't running the universities exclusively as a business. These are also a public good. These are important public goods for our state, where they have a lot of missions that are embedded in our Constitution, important principles envisioned by the founders of this state. And so there are multiple reasons that we need to make sure that our institutions are strong, but the regents are keeping a very tight check on this. We've implemented a lot of reforms around tuition, much more transparency, much more predictability for families. 2 of the 3 universities now have tuition guarantee programs. Those are all important so that we can make sure that we're keeping a check on this. And we aren't simply going to allow the institutions to charge whatever they want. It really has to be in relationship to what the costs are and really what the value is.
How are we doing in relation to what it costs to send a kid to one of the 3 universities compared to our competitive states around us? And I'm thinking, not necessarily next door to us, but Texas, Colorado, California, Nevada. How do we stack up? Utah?
Arizona's public universities are still a great deal. They are still very affordable, very competitive with their peers. But if we allow tuition to continue to increase, we won't be able to claim that. And it's important that we have accessible and affordable higher education institutions because of the demands that employers will have for that labor going forward.
One more thing before we move into competition. This idea that Arizona is still kind of a bargain, does it cause the universities to start to want out-of-state students because they pay more? They pay what, double?
The out-of-state students pay significantly more, at least 50% more than our in-state students.
California's going through this. The UC system wants these out-of-state, even out-of-country students because they pay so much more.
Yes, and California certainly has recognized that Arizona's been very welcoming to California students, and we want to continue to welcome out-of-state students. Still today, to be clear, the majority of our students come from Arizona, and we want to make sure that every Arizona student has an opportunity to go to one of our universities.
Is that still there? Is that still, that number still available?
They are more than the majority of our students come from Arizona, and will continue to do so. But we like having out-of-state and out-of-country students. They add to the diverse mix on our campuses. That's really important in a world for students going forward that is, it's a world marketplace.
Right.
And they won't just be competing against students in Utah. But having said that, those students who come from out of state and out of country definitely help the bottom line.
You talked about competition, you talked about other things out there and pricing yourselves out of the market. How do you now work in the University of Phoenixes of the world, who offers something else online that's competing against you guys?
In Arizona, we should be delighted that we have a more vibrant higher education marketplace. Our students, the people here, need every option available to them So I think having increased competition in the higher education marketplace is a good thing. I think it's good for them and it's good for us, but mostly it's good for the students. We need multiple pathways. The point, though, is to make sure that families understand really what they're getting no matter which choice they make. So we are going to continue to be strong advocates for making sure that all of these institutions are very transparent around outcomes, and that no matter which course a student might choose, whichever path they might choose, that ultimately we know that all of these institutions are able to graduate students. That's what matters, not just whether you can attract them and get them started, but can you get them over the goal line and get them to a degree.
Right. Arizona had the nation's steepest per student cuts in state aid to higher ed and the highest rates of tuition increases from before the recession to now. So you can see this relationship and what's happening. There are some people really steamed, and they're threatening to go to the ballot box through initiative to try to fix this. What's your take on that? What's the board's take on that?
The budget cuts have definitely created an outcry and a big race for the ballot for 2016. And my caution would be this, that as much as I appreciate the energy and enthusiasm around that, we really need to make sure that there really is a long-term plan for the universities. Additional revenues would be great, but we also need to make sure that there is still support coming directly from the state. I don't think we want to be managing our universities simply from the ballot box.
Would it be impossible to ask the state or try to mandate, because there is no funding floor right now? Would you be hamstringing the state too much to say, we're going to put it at 50%. The state should do 50%, which is what kind of traditionally happened.
Those are the conversations we want to have with policymakers to really understand what will the state's contributions be. We can't just call these public universities and not assume that there's going to be some level of public contribution to go with that. That certainly was the original model envisioned. We need to stick to that. We need to understand really at a minimum what will the state be providing going forward. We're
going to hear from Governor Ducey. We'll hear from the governor in just a moment about this debate about higher education and the really severe cuts that just happened, $104 million. In the budget. We're back with Eileen Klein, president of the Arizona Board of Regents, right after this. The cuts to higher education are dramatic in the governor's new budget. It was originally talked that they would cut about $77 million from higher ed. That number soared to $104 million, and a lot of people are crying foul. Here's what the governor said about the choices involved here.
You'll see more money in the classroom where learning happens, and you'll see $134 million additional in new classroom spending in this budget. This protects taxpayers by rejecting calls to raise taxes. It asks all areas of government to share the work, tighten the belt, and find savings.
Well, the governor, when he's talking about that, he's really talking about K through 12. And I think when it came down to it, he had to make a choice here. What was he going to save? And I think he was erring on the side of K through 12.
And it's understandable. It's understandable. And the people of the state need a strong K-12 system. The universities need a strong K-12 system. But we can't make the belt so tight that we can't breathe. That's the concern. It's not just the cuts that went down in this budget. It's the $400 million in cuts that came before it. It's the $200 million in back payments. Right. It's the $700 million in capital outlay that hasn't been paid. Where does it end?
You worked on the 9th floor. You were the Governor Brewer's right-hand person. What do you think he should have cut? Was there some other place to get the money?
I will be the first to say that the choices are very limited in budget cutting exercises. The choices are very limited. So again, it wasn't unexpected that universities would be cut. The frustration is that the number increased so much over what he had originally proposed. So that 30% increase in the proposed cuts versus the final cuts, that's a big difference. That's going to definitely have an impact. We have university presidents now, apart from impacts on tuition and fees, who've already suggested they might have to consider either program eliminations, changes in student aid, or potentially even layoffs. So we don't want to panic people, but at the same time, we have to understand that services live at the end of those line items, services to students, and they'll be impacted.
We've got about 15 seconds. Since you spoke with the governor this week, are you hopeful that when we sit here a year from now, it's going to be a better situation?
I am very hopeful, and I'm encouraged. The trends all suggest that our state is recovering,
Revenues
albeit
are coming
slowly.
in better?
Revenues are coming in better. The point is now, how do we cement a plan that's going to make our universities grow and thrive in the future? That's what we want to work with them
Great
on.
to see you.
Thank
Eileen
you.
Klein, our guest on Newsmaker Sunday. We'll have you back.
Thank you so much.
And good luck in a difficult time. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week on Newsmaker Sunday.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel and get all the best videos from Fox 10.